Tira Vanachari Jamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jayom Vishnupad Paramhansa Paribrajakacharyastu Tarasatashi Shimad A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Ananta Koti Vaishnavrinda Ki Jai Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai Prem Sukho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivas Arigor Bhaktavrinda Ki Jai Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinatha Shama Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhan Ki Jai Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai Mayapur Dham Ki Jai Jagannath Puri Ki Jai Bhakti Devi Ki Jai Tulsi Maharani Ki Jai Ganga Mai Ki Jai Jamuna Mai Ki Jai Samaveda Bhaktavrinda Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Shri Shri Guru and Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Today we're continuing today with the reading from Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita by His Holiness Satsvarup Das Goswami, Volume 2, chapter entitled Breaking Ground. Srila Prabhupada, he was walking on the street, 2nd Avenue one day, and he met one young man who was a professor, PhD, of English. And he asked this young man to please bring your friends to the classes. He showed Howard Wheeler, who would later become Hayagriva, where this 26 2nd Avenue was. So now Howard has come, and before we start the reading, I wanted to show all of you some very special documents that have been very kindly given by the archives, the Bhaktivedanta archives, that is located in America, in an area called North Carolina. After Srila Prabhupada disappeared, all of his audio, all of his writings, and all of the photos of Srila Prabhupada, along with all of the important documents of ISKCON, were collected by the Bhaktivedanta archives, and they very kindly gave to us, for this class, some of the important documents that are related to what we're reading now. We know that Srila Prabhupada incorporated ISKCON at 26 2nd Avenue, the first week of July. It took about a week or two for it to be going through the process in New York City, and then the society was incorporated. So the lawyer or the advocate who prepared the certificate for incorporation and all of the papers required, he had to have some material describing what Srila Prabhupada's purpose was for incorporating ISKCON. So Prabhupada gave him some of his earlier writings, for instance, the prospectus that he had made for the League of Devotees when he was preaching in Jhansi. And here, Prabhupada was way ahead of his time. Nowadays, the big businesses, the CEOs, and all of the very successful organizations that have what's called a mission statement. So Srila Prabhupada, what he did was, very early in his preaching, after he took sannyas, he created what he called My Mission. And he described there his aspiration to completely translate Srimad Bhagavatam in the English language. And he asked people to become the sponsors, the patrons, and the members of his League of Devotees. So that is the first document that we see here called My Mission. And on the bottom he wrote some of the very prominent supporters of his mission. Next, Prabhupada created what is called the Constitution of Association. Just as with any nation, they have a constitution that describes the laws within that society. So Srila Prabhupada, in his Constitution of Association, he first gave the name of the society, the headquarters being the Radha Krishna Temple of 26 2nd Avenue, although there were no deities there at that time. But Prabhupada, we heard from the first volume, Prabhupada's first aspiration was to establish a Radha Krishna Temple in New York City. So Prabhupada had every intention of making this center a Radha Krishna Temple, and he eventually did, but not at 26 2nd Avenue. When they moved down the street, 61 2nd Avenue, that was when Radha and Krishna were installed. So Prabhupada has here the objectives for which the society is being established, A, B, C, all the way up to N. N, and then within N, Prabhupada describes the lifestyle of Varnashram. All of these different principles Prabhupada wanted to establish in ISKCON. So Stephen Goldsmith, the advocate, he took these important documents that Prabhupada had prepared, and he made the certificate of incorporation because he knew how to legally present things so that it would be accepted. And Stephen Goldsmith, he only gave from A to G. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of the principles. Although Srila Prabhupada had given about 13 to 15 principles in his constitution, he reduced that. And then he described the different, because according to the law there have to be trustees for 1 year, then the 2nd year, then the 3rd year. So Stephen Goldsmith knew how to prepare all of that. And on the evening of July 7th, we'll read this in the next weeks coming up, he came with these papers and he got the signatures of all of those young men and women who agreed to become trustees of ISKCON. Now, some of them were just guests. One of them was the landlord of 26 2nd Avenue. No one amongst all of the trustees had fully dedicated themselves at that time to Srila Prabhupada's original mission. But they were very sympathetic to Prabhupada and to what he was trying to accomplish in America. So they agreed to become trustees. Later, you'll see here, later they did take initiation, many of them. For instance, Michael Grant, who found 26 2nd Avenue, later became Mukunda Das. Now he's Mukunda Das Goswami. Last week we saw a video that he specially prepared for us. Was that shown? It didn't get shown? It was shown, yes. Because he took a lot of trouble to do that for our class. And then his wife, Janaki, they were some of the first initiates of Srila Prabhupada. James Green became Jagannath. Paul Gardner was the landlord. Donald Chapdelaine, he was just a guest who agreed to sign the incorporation papers. Then Raymond Mares, he became the editor of the Back to Godhead magazine. Prabhupada named him Rai Ram. And we heard about Carl Jurgens. Karl allowed Prabhupada to stay at his apartment when Prabhupada had to flee his apartment, the loft in the Bowery. So he also took initiation, and Prabhupada named him Karlapati. Raphael Balsam, he never got initiated, and Robert Lefkowitz, he became the first Rabindra Sarup of Srila Prabhupada's disciples. When he left Prabhupada's shelter, Prabhupada initiated another devotee by the name of Rabindra Sarup. So each year, each one of these trustees agreed to become the trustees for that year, 3 each year. So we see these papers that were finally accepted by the state of New York. And amazingly, Mukunda, he explains in some of his memories that because Mukunda became a part of this incorporation, when he later was sent by Srila Prabhupada to San Francisco to open the first temple in California, he used this exact same incorporation certificate to incorporate the society in California. And then after he did that, he took the same papers to London, and from there, the papers were taken to Bombay. So these particular incorporation papers were extremely important for establishing the society all over the world, both in the Western countries and also in India. And that way, because Prabhupada did not want central organization of ISKCON, he wanted each temple to be individually governed by the devotees who were serving in that temple. And that means in every city where the devotees started a temple, they had to incorporate the society, get tax exemption, and in that way they became very strong within their temples. Otherwise, Prabhupada said there would be too much paperwork, too many invoices to sign, so he wanted the temples to independently manage themselves. And they did that by following the same pro forma of the 26 Second Avenue Temple. Now these are you see, in America, the whole country was established on freedom of religion. The first immigrants who came there, they came because they were being persecuted in Europe for their religion. So the whole Constitution of America is based on freedom of religions, freedom of speech, and the government run by the people and of the people. So you have here, by the grace of God, free and independent. So in that way, each state, they were able to establish religious societies. There was no state religion. For instance, in the Islamist countries, Islam is the state religion. And if you don't follow it, you're considered a blasphemer, things like that. The English have their English church. In Italy, they have their Roman Catholics. In Greece, they have the Greek Orthodox. So there are state religions. But in America, they would not allow any state religion. That way, anyone could be free to worship God as they saw fit according to their scriptures. So this gave Prabhupada the freedom to incorporate the teachings of Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, and the Vedic Shastras within the religious system of America. And these are the certificates. Then with those certificates, these are the state of California certificates. And then what the devotees had to do was, we had been hearing about how the devotees were being forced to enter into the army to fight in the Vietnam War. So what they wanted to do was, they wanted what's called conscientious objection. That means according to their religious beliefs, they were not allowed to take part in war. So being now a religious society, a tax-exempt society. They then had to prove themselves to be a religious organization that the members were ministers and would not be forced to take part in the Vietnam War. So that's more letters that are given here. I had never seen them before. I wanted to share them before we start the reading today because they're very important for us to understand how ISKCON was established first in America and then throughout the world. So now we'll start reading. This was when Howard had just met Prabhupada, and he was coming now to the temple. And Satsvarup Maharaj, because he was also coming at this time, he understood what the atmosphere of the temple was. So he gave a very vivid description of every detail, what happened Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings when Prabhupada had his Bhagavad Gita classes and his kirtans. The summer evening was warm because this is July. July is very uncomfortable in New York City. For instance, if you go to Delhi, there's so much smog. So in New York, it's also like that. It becomes very uncomfortable there in the month of July. And in the storefront, the back windows and front door were opened wide. Young men, several of them dressed in black denims and button-down sport shirts with broad, dull stripes, had left their worn sneakers by the front door and were now sitting on the floor. So there's a setup at the doorway so that everyone could put their shoes there. And later on, because the Hare Krishna devotees became famous for not wearing shoes within their temples, there used to be tour guides for the young people and how to do things for $1 a day, $5 a day, how to travel very cheaply. So one of the recommendations was that if you need shoes, go to the Hare Krishna temple and just pick up something at the door. Because all the young people knew that all the doors were there, all the shoes were there right at the door. Because Prabhupada would make everyone take their shoes off when they entered. Most of them were from the Lower East Side. No one had had to go to great trouble to come here. The little room was barren. So when Prabhupada first moved in, there was no furniture, there were no pictures, they just had one asan, like a manch, for Prabhupada to sit on, but there was no decorations, they just had the straw mats. No pictures, no furniture, no rug, not even a chair. Only a few plain straw mats. A single bulb hung from the ceiling into the center of the room. It was 7 o'clock, and about a dozen people had gathered when the Swami suddenly opened the side door and entered the room. Now this storefront that Prabhupada had rented, it was only big enough to hold about 20 people. So this description is 12 people had come that evening because Prabhupada was just starting. And some people who saw the sign outside, they were attracted to Bhagavad Gita classes. Prabhupada was in the right place at the right time because the young people on Lower East Side were looking for alternative lifestyles and they were interested in Eastern philosophy. He wasn't wearing a shirt, and the saffron cloth that draped his torso left his arms and some of his chest bare. His complexion was smooth golden brown, and as they watched him, his head shaven, his ears long-lobed, and his aspect grave, he seemed like pictures they'd seen of the Buddha in meditation. He was old, yet erect in his posture, fresh and radiant. His forehead was decorated with the yellowish clay markings of the Vaishnavas. Prabhupada recognized big bearded Howard and smiled. "You have brought your friends?" "Yes," Howard answered in his loud, resonant voice. "Ah, very good." So Prabhupada was sitting in front of the group and he was about to start his kirtan. Prabhupada stepped out of his white shoes, sat down on a thin mat, faced his congregation, and indicated they could all be seated. He distributed several pairs of brass hand cymbals and briefly demonstrated the rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So by this time, Prabhupada had gotten kartals, that he had sent from, the devotees had sent from the Gaudiya Math in Mathura. They mailed them to him. So now he had kartals. And what the devotees did was they found little finger bells, they're like tiny little kartals that they would attach to their fingers. They would have little bells. And Prabhupada encouraged, even from the Bowery time, any musical instruments you have, you bring them and you do your music for Krishna. When Michael Grant first met Prabhupada, he explained to him that he was a musician. Prabhupada asked, "What instrument do you play?" And Michael said, "I play the piano." Prabhupada said, "I will teach you how to play the piano for Krishna." So Prabhupada, he was teaching all of these young men and women, whatever you do, whatever you enjoy doing, now you do it for Krishna. So they would bring their musical instruments. He began playing a startling, ringing sound. He began singing, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Now it was the audience's turn. Chant, he told them. Some already knew. Gradually the others caught on. And after a few rounds, all were chanting together. Most of these young men and a few young women present had at one time or another embarked on the psychedelic voyage in search of a new world of expanded consciousness. Boldly and recklessly, they had entered the turbulent, forbidden waters of LSD, peyote, and magic mushrooms. So, the taking of intoxication for spiritual enlightenment was not a new thing. In many cultures, there were hallucinogenic substances that were taken by the shamans, by the priests. For instance, here you have the Shivites who take ganja. And in other societies, for instance, in the South American civilizations, they had what was called peyote. Peyote is a cactus. And within that cactus is a juice. And that juice contains a hallucinogenic chemical. Technically, it's called mescaline. That comes from a cactus. And then magic mushrooms. There are specific mushrooms. Some mushrooms are poisonous. Some mushrooms are edible. And some mushrooms, if you eat them, you become intoxicated. And you get, so this LSD, which is a particular chemical, was a synthetic form of these hallucinogenic chemicals that were simulated by the modern day scientists, so that the young people could get these so-called spiritual experiences by taking LSD, by taking peyote, or by taking magic mushrooms. They were called shrooms. So this was becoming a part of the young culture, that along with spiritual seeking, they would add to it these intoxicants and hallucinogenic drugs, feeling that this would increase their spiritual realizations. Actually, Prabhupada very strongly explained to them, you don't need any of these things. Simply the transcendental sound vibrations and the knowledge itself, that will bring you to the highest spiritual realization. Heedless of warnings, they had risked everything and done it. Yet there was merit in their valor, their eagerness to find the extra dimensions of the self, to get beyond ordinary existence, even if they didn't know what was beyond was or whether they would ever return to the comfort of the ordinary. So because so many young people were taking these hallucinogenic drugs, some of them were not able, according to their physical constitution, their mental capacity, some of them were very negatively affected by taking these intoxications, and they would end up in the insane asylums. If you read the book Journey Home by Radhanath Swami, he describes some of the unfortunate incidences that he saw when his friends were taking these psychedelic drugs. If you're interested in knowing those things, you can read his book. We don't have to go into detail here. But it was actually a risk. It was a danger to take these drugs. And there was no guarantee that you were going to have a spiritual experience. Many times you had what was called a bad trip. And that means a very negative experience. Nonetheless, whatever truth they had found, they remained unfulfilled. And whatever worlds they had reached, these young psychedelic voyagers had always returned to the Lower East Side. Now they were sampling the Hare Krishna mantra. So as with any intoxicant, the effect is temporary. And these very strong intoxicants that they were taking now, LSD, peyote, and mushrooms, they wouldn't last for more than 6 to 8 hours, and then they would have to come back to the stark reality of their life with the same problems, the same searching, with no real solution. When the kirtan suddenly sprang up from the Swami's cymbals and sonorous voice, they immediately felt that it was going to be something far out. Far out is a hippie expression. That means extraordinary, beyond normal daily experience. Here was another chance to trip out. So when you take these hallucinogenic drugs, it's called taking a trip, because you go into another world, an illusory world, but then you have to come back. And willingly, they began to flow with it. So now Prabhupada, the expression in the first prospectus that was printed in 26 Second Avenue, the top of it would say, "Stay high forever." So this was a way, by Prabhupada giving this mantra, these transcendental sound vibrations for this particular age, these young people who were looking for spiritual realizations through the drugs, artificially, now through the transcendental sound vibrations, they didn't come down. They were actually able to stay high forever by chanting the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. They would surrender their minds and explore the limits of the chanting for all it was worth. Most of them had already associated the mantra with the mystical Upanishads and Gita, which had called out to them in words of mystery, eternal spirit, negating illusion. But whatever it is, this Indian mantra, let it come, they thought. Let its waves carry us far and high. Let's take it and let the effects come. So these young people, the ones who had come to the 26 Second Avenue, the first temple, and then a few months later when Prabhupada took the chanting out into the streets for the first time publicly, he had his young followers go to Tompkins Square Park, to St. Mark's Square. These are all very beautiful parks in New York City. The other people who were listening, they had never heard the mantra before. But by the effect of this transcendental sound vibration, people would just on their own, start to chant and also dance along with the devotees. So that was the transcendental effect of the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. Without even understanding the meaning of the mantra, the effect was there. And that is why when Prabhupada made his first record and introduced the Maha Mantra on the record, he explained that anyone can take part in chanting, even a child, even an animal, anyone can chant Hare Krishna and get the transcendental result of spiritual realization. And these young people were now experiencing that. Whatever the price, let it come. The chanting seemed simple and natural enough. It was sweet and wasn't going to harm anyone. It was in its own way far out. As Prabhupada chanted in his own inner ecstasy, he observed his motley congregation. He was breaking ground in a new land now, because first he was up in the upper west side, where he had Dr. Mishra's students coming and chanting with him. Then, because of the theft there, he moved to the Bowery. There he had musicians and artists chanting along with him. And because one of these drug crazy young men drove Prabhupada out of the loft, Prabhupada had now come to the epicenter of the counterculture in New York City, which was Lower East Side. And the young people there, although they were all highly educated, because the young people in America are naturally educated, they all go through, and for instance, Howard Wheeler being a professor, they were not foolish or ignorant, they were searchers. But by social standards, they had stepped away from mainstream society as a counterculture. Counterculture means they were not living as most normal Americans were living. As the hand cymbals rang, the lead and response of the Hare Krishna mantra swelled, filling the evening. Some neighbors were annoyed because we had heard a few weeks ago how actually this 26 Second Avenue area was ghetto. Ghetto means when the immigrants came, the German, then the Irish, then the Jews, now it was Puerto Ricans, Ukrainians. Very poor immigrants were all living in that area. And they weren't accustomed to chanting of mantras, singing and dancing in their neighborhood. So some neighbors were annoyed. Puerto Rican children, enchanted, appeared at the door and window looking. Twilight came. Exotic it was, yet anyone could see that a Swami was raising an ancient prayer in praise of God. This wasn't rock or jazz, because at the loft, when Prabhupada lived at the Bowery, most of the young men and women who were coming, they were coming to just enjoy the music, so they could just jam together, have good music together. But Prabhupada was very serious. He understood the power of the Maha Mantra, and therefore he was chanting in his own personal ecstasy, and these people, they were, through the sound vibration, experiencing now something spiritual. He was a holy man, a Swami, making a public religious demonstration, but the combination was strange. An old Indian Swami chanting an ancient mantra with a storefront full of young American hippies singing along. Prabhupada sang on, his shaven head held high and tilted, his body trembling slightly with emotion. Confidently, he led the mantra, absorbed in pure devotion, and they responded. More passerbys were drawn to the front window and open door. Some jeered, but the chanting was too strong. Within the sound of the kirtan, even the car horns were a faint staccato. because this Second Avenue, being on the Lower East Side, all the trucks and commercial vehicles and the passenger cars and the taxis, this Second Avenue was a main thoroughfare going through the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The traffic was nonstop, all hours of the day and night. And traffic means noise. The cars honking, the brakes, the gears, the smoke, the fumes from the cars itself and the trucks. So that was the atmosphere that Prabhupada was chanting these transcendental sound vibrations in. It wasn't the bank of the Jamuna or the Himalayan mountains. It was right in the middle of a city, the biggest city in the world at that time. The vibration of auto engines and the rumble of trucks continued, but in the distance now, unnoticed. Gathered under the dim electric light in the bare room, the group chanted after their leader, growing gradually from a feeble, hesitant chorus to an approximate harmony of voices. This is what happens with Sankirtan. Everyone joins together in glorification of Sri Krishna, and they all feel as one, glorifying the Lord. So this was happening even though the young people couldn't understand the mantra. They were feeling the effects of the mantra. They continued clapping and chanting, putting into it whatever they could, in hopes of discovering its secrets. This Swami was not simply giving some 5-minute sample demonstration. For the moment, he was their leader, their guide in an unknown realm. Howard and Keith's little encounter with the kirtan in Calcutta had left them outsiders, because Howard and Keith, they became Hayagriva and Kirtanananda. They had gone to India looking for a guru. They were unsuccessful. They went to the Himalayas, they went to Calcutta, and in Calcutta, they heard the Gaudiya Vaishnavas chanting the same mantra. But they were outsiders. No one invited them to take part. No one spoke to them. There was a language barrier. So although they had heard the mantra as a seed, they couldn't enter into its understandings. And now Krishna had sent Prabhupada from Calcutta right to the Lower East Side to carry them forward in their spiritual life. The chanting had never before come like this, right in the middle of the Lower East Side, with the genuine Swami leading them. So these young men, they actually understood that because their quest was unsuccessful in India, they couldn't find a guru. They heard the mantra, they didn't know what to do with the mantra, so Krishna sent a guru to them, right in the place where they were living. They just lived 5 blocks away from Prabhupada, and they met Prabhupada the same time Prabhupada moved in there. That's how Krishna works. In their minds were psychedelic ambitions to see the face of God, fantasies and visions of Hindu teachings, and the presumption that it was all impersonal light, because according to the Shankar philosophy, which was most prominent, just like Dr. Mishra, he was teaching the impersonalist Mayavad philosophy. This was what was most popularly being taught in America at that time. No bhakti yogi had come to America until Srila Prabhupada arrived. So all they had heard was the philosophy of the Ramakrishna mission, the philosophy of the Shankarites, the Mayavadis, and the philosophy of the Hatha yogis, who were teaching exercises for physical raising of the chakras, but nothing really spiritual. It wasn't until Prabhupada came and gave the message of bhakti yoga that these young people became satisfied at last. Prabhupada had encountered a similar group on the Bowery, and he knew this group wasn't experiencing the mantra in the proper discipline, reverence, and knowledge. but he let them chant in their own way. In time, their submission to the spiritual sound, their purification, and their enlightenment and ecstasy in chanting and hearing Hare Krishna would come. We can all remember the first time that we saw the devotees chanting. It just took a few minutes with the experience of hearing the sound vibrations and getting some association with the devotees, that ecstasy of chanting drew us to come and get more association with the devotees and finally dedicate our lives. So this Hare Krishna mantra is beyond magic. It's transcendental. It's Krishna dancing on our tongues. And all we have to do is surrender to that sound vibration. And as Prabhupada, he right here, they just had to submit to the spiritual sound. They would naturally become purified. Their enlightenment and ecstasy in chanting and hearing Hare Krishna would come, all of its own accord by the power of the holy name. He stopped kirtan. So this kirtan will go on for half an hour, from 7 to 7:30. The chanting had swept back the world, but now the Lower East Side rushed in again. The children at the door began to chatter and laugh. Cars and trucks made their rumblings heard once more, and a voice shouted from a nearby apartment, demanding quiet. Now, there's another devotee who came with them. His name was Charles Barnett. He became a Chutananda in the second initiation. So he says more clearly in his book called Blazing Sadhus, he said the man was shouting from his window, "Shut up!" Because the kids were so noisy and the chanting was going on. He was yelling, "Shut up! Shut up!" Sasru Maharaj says it a little more aesthetically. It was now past 7:30. Half an hour had elapsed. Now Prabhupada for 1 hour will give a lecture from the Bhagavad Gita. His lecture is very basic, and yet for restless youth, heavily philosophical. Some can't take it, and they rise rudely upon hearing the Swami's first words, put on their shoes at the front door, and return to the street. Others have left as soon as they saw the singing was over. Still, this is his best group yet. A few of the Bowery congregation are present. The boys from Mott Street are here. That's Hayagriva, and he had about 5 friends. They all took initiation. Umapati, Achutananda, and others also came amongst their friends. And they're specifically looking for a guru. Many in the group have already read Bhagavad Gita, and they're not too proud to hear and admit that they didn't understand it. Even Brahmananda, who came just a few weeks later, he had done his dissertation in college on the Bhagavad Gita, but they couldn't enter into the real teachings of the Bhagavad Gita because, as Prabhupada explains, that most of the commentators were envious of Krishna. They weren't, because Krishna explains in the 9th canto, in the 9th chapter, that I am giving you this most confidential knowledge to Arjuna because you are not envious. And then Prabhupada explains in that purport that envy means Krishna is saying, surrender unto me, give up everything, do as I tell you. But the commentators say it is not to Krishna to whom we should surrender, it is to the unborn within Krishna. And they take the words of Krishna and they use it for their own, sometimes political purposes, sometimes for whatever their reasons are for commentating on Bhagavad Gita. It's not to give the message of Krishna. So therefore Prabhupada calls them envious. And that's why, even though they were studying Bhagavad Gita, they could not understand Bhagavad Gita. Nearby, a big dog is barking. Row, row, row. The traffic creates constant rumbling. Just outside the window, little girls are shrieking, and all this makes lecturing difficult. So now that the chanting is stopped, all of the sounds from outside are entering, because Prabhupada would keep the door open so the people could go in. Yet despite the distraction of children, traffic, and dogs, he wants the door open. If it is closed, he says, "Why is it closed? People may come in." Prabhupada had an open door policy. He wanted the door open. That's why our doors are always open at the temple. He continues, undaunted, quoting Sanskrit, holding his audience, and developing his urgent message, while the relentless cacophony means sounds that don't all fit together, sounds coming from all different directions, rivals his every word. Row, 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 that's the dogs. Eek, ya, that's the shrieking, shrieking like little Spanish witches. The girls disturb the whole block. In the distance, a man shouts from the window, get out of here, to the girls, because they're making disturbance in the whole neighborhood, not just for Prabhupada. Prabhupada, ask them not to make noise. Roy, that's Ram Roy, who later became initiated, Roy Malish, one of the boys in the temple, the man is chasing the kids now. Prabhupada, yes, these children are making a disturbance. Ask them. Roy, yes, that's what the man's chasing them right now. Prabhupada, they're making noises. Roy, yes, he's chasing them now. The man chases the children away, but they'll be back. You can't chase the children off the street. They live there. And the big dog never stops barking. And who can stop the cars? The cars are always there. So this is what Prabhupada's up against. And still, the sincere and the real searchers sat there and listened to Prabhupada for a whole hour. Prabhupada uses the cars to give an example. When a car momentarily comes into our vision on 2nd Avenue, we certainly don't think that it had no existence before we saw it, or that it ceases to exist once it has passed from view. Similarly, when Krishna goes from this planet to another, it doesn't mean he no longer exists, although it may appear that way. Actually, he has only left our sight. Krishna and his incarnations constantly appear and disappear on innumerable planets throughout the innumerable universes of the material creation. So therefore, Krishna, he makes his appearance, and then after a certain amount of time, he disappears from our sight. And Prabhupada used that example of the cars passing by the temple, that they existed before they got there, and they're going to exist afterwards also, just we can't see them. And that's the way God is also in his many incarnations. The cars are always passing, roaring and rumbling through every word Prabhupada speaks. The door is open, and he is poised at the edge of a river of carbon monoxide, asphalt, rumbling tires, and constant waves of traffic. He has come a long way from the banks of his Jamuna in Vrindavan, where great saints and sages have gathered through the ages to discuss Krishna consciousness. But his audience lives here, amid this scene. So he has come here, beside 2nd Avenue's rushing river of traffic, to speak loudly the ageless message. Now, why did Prabhupada take all this trouble? Why? Because he was the emissary coming through the entire parampara, on the dream of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, on the order of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. Prabhupada made that order his life and soul, and here he was now, on the river of traffic, giving the same timeless message that the entire parampara had previously given only in India. He is still stressing the same point. Whatever you do in Krishna consciousness, however little it may be, is eternally good for you. Yet now, more than uptown or on the Bowery, he is calling his hearers to take to Krishna consciousness fully and become devotees. He assures them, anyone can become a devotee and friend of Krishna like Arjuna. You will be surprised that Lord Chaitanya's principal disciples were all so-called fallen in society. He appointed Haridas Thakur to the highest position in his spiritual mission, although he happened to take birth in a Mohammedan family. So there is no bar for anyone. Everyone can become spiritual master, provided he knows the science of Krishna. So this picture is when Prabhupada took the chanting out into the parks. The parks had people just taking walks, walking their dogs, people sunbathing on the grass, but they would all hear the chanting and they would take part. They have their musical instruments, they would sit and listen and go along with the chanting. This is the science of Krishna, this Bhagavad Gita, and if anyone knows it perfectly, then he becomes a spiritual master. And this transcendental vibration, Hare Krishna, will help us by cleaning the dust from the mirror of our mind. On the mind we have accumulated material dust, just like on 2nd Avenue. Due to the constant traffic of motor cars, there's always a creation of dust over everything. So Prabhupada was speaking to his audience in the same examples that they would understand. The cars, the dust, the dirt, how we cleanse all that dust and dirt through the chanting because of the mantra, freeing the mind of all the dirt. Similarly, by our manipulation of materialistic activities, there are some material dust which are accumulated on the mind, and therefore we are unable to see things in true perspective. So this process, the vibration of the transcendental sound, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, will cleanse the dust. So Prabhupada, in his lecture, he's helping them understand why this particular mantra, why are we chanting Hare Krishna? And as soon as the dust is cleared, then as you see your nice face in the mirror, similarly, you can see your real constitutional position as spirit soul. In Sanskrit language, it is said, Bhava Mahadav Agni. Now, we know that that means that that is the raging forest fire of material existence. Lord Chaitanya said that. Lord Chaitanya's picture you have seen in the front window. He is dancing and chanting Hare Krishna. So it doesn't matter what a person was doing before, what sinful activities. A person may not be perfect at first, but if he is engaged in service, then he will be purified. Suddenly, a Bowery derelict enters, because the Bowery is just a short 10-minute walk from where Prabhupada was, whistling and drunkenly shouting. The audience remains seated, not knowing what to make of it. The drunken man says, "How are you? I'll be right back. I brought another thing." So it sounds like this man knew Prabhupada from the Bowery, where all the drunks lived, because he said, "I'll be right back." Prabhupada, "Don't disturb, sit down. We are talking seriously." The drunk, "I'll put it up there. In a church? All right, I'll be right back." The man is white-haired with a short grizzly beard and frowsy clothing. His odor reeks through the temple. So a drunkard, if you've ever come in contact with a drunkard, from their breath comes the smell of alcohol, and from their clothing comes a smell of urine, stool, because they don't have control over themselves in their intoxication. So very unclean, mode of pure ignorance and darkness, the drunkards. But then he suddenly careens out the door and is gone. Prabhupada chuckles softly and returns immediately to his lecture. So it doesn't matter what a person was doing before. So Prabhupada just uses this as an example, this man walking into the temple. If he engages in Krishna consciousness, chanting Hare Krishna and Bhagavad Gita, it should be concluded that he is a saint. He is a saintly person. Apichet duracharo. Never mind if he may have some external immoral habit due to his past association. It doesn't matter. Some way or other one should become Krishna conscious, and then gradually he will become a saintly person as he goes on executing this process of Krishna consciousness. So of course the audience, Prabhupada was quoting Sanskrit. The audience didn't know Sanskrit. But fortunately, we now have the Bhagavad Gita fully translated by Prabhupada. Prabhupada was quoting Bhagavad Gita 9:30. Even if one commits the most abominable action, if he is engaged in devotional service, he is to be considered saintly because he is properly situated in his determination. So this is the last paragraph for this evening. Even if a person is considered immoral from the mundane point of view, he should be regarded as moral if he acts on the platform of Krishna consciousness. Sometimes a person in Krishna consciousness may appear to act immorally. For instance, in the dead of night, the young cowherd girls of Vrindavan left their husbands and fathers to go to the forest to see Krishna. From the materialistic point of view, this is immoral. But because their actions were connected with Krishna, they are considered highly moral. By nature, Arjuna was not inclined to kill, even at the risk of his kingdom, but Krishna wanted him to fight. Therefore, Arjuna entered the battle and acted morally, even though he was killing people. So we'll stop here, and next week we'll hear what happens when the drunken man returns to the temple, and how Prabhupada, you can use everything that's going on around him. He sees everything with Jnana Chakshus, Shastra Chakshus, everything that he's observing here in this wild world of 2nd Avenue, Lower East Side, he connects to Krishna.